On a January afternoon in 1919, a wave 25 feet tall came down a Boston street at 35 miles an hour. It flattened buildings, snapped the legs off a steel railway, and killed 21 people. And it wasn't water. It was molasses, 2.3 million gallons of it. I know how that sounds. For 100 years, this disaster has been stuck as a punchline, the silly footnote, where a city got attacked by desert. But say it out loud, slowly. A wave taller than a house, heavier than water, moving faster than you can sprint. Through a crowded neighborhood at lunchtime, the people who lived through it never once found it funny. And the reason it happened isn't strange at all. It's the most familiar story in the world. A company knew, and the company chose paint. That's the real story I'm going to tell you. Because the fix they used for a leaking 50-foot steel tank was literally a coat of brown paint. Start in the North End, Boston's crowded Italian immigrant quarter, on the 15th of January, 1919. Lunchtime, unseasonably warm after a brutal cold snap. On the waterfront at 529 Commercial Street stood a steel tank 50 feet tall and 90 feet across, owned by United States Industrial Alcohol. Inside sat 2.3 million gallons of molasses, waiting to become industrial alcohol. This wasn't for gingerbread. Distilled molasses fed munitions production, which is why the tank had gone up in a wartime hurry back in 1915. At about 12:30, people nearby heard a sound witnesses compared to a machine gun. It was the rivets, hundreds of steel rivets firing out of the tank walls, one after another, as the seams unzipped. Then the tank simply ceased to exist and everything inside it stood up and moved. Here's the physics that turns a pantry item into a weapon. Molasses is heavier than water, half again heavier, so the wave carried more weight than any flood the same size, and it doesn't behave like water. Water hits you and passes. Molasses arrives fast while the pressure of the wave keeps it thin, and the moment it slows down it thickens and sets around whatever it caught. People weren't just knocked down, they were held. Rescuers described pulling victims out like flies from flypaper, and for some, the grip won. A truck driver was thrown into the harbor. Horses went down whole. A 10-year-old boy named Pasquale Iantosca, gathering firewood near the tank, was swept off his feet in front of his father. The elevated railway overhead lost its legs, the track buckling minutes after a packed train had passed. 21 people died. About 150 more were hurt. And hold on to the name Maria DiStasio, another kid by the tank that day, because what she was doing there is the whole story. Sailors from a training ship docked nearby, the USS Nantucket, ran into waist-deep syrup to drag people clear, and the harbor ran brown into the summer. So now the only question that matters: why did a brand new tank fall apart? Because it was never really built. It was rushed. The war needed alcohol. The company needed the tank before a big molasses shipment arrived, and construction wrapped in 1915 without a single proper test. The standard check would have been filling it with water and watching the seams. They put a few inches in the bottom, called it good, and pumped in molasses within days. The tank complained immediately. It groaned when full. It shed flakes of steel. And it leaked from the very first week, badly enough that neighborhood kids brought cups and pails to collect their own free molasses off the tank's walls. That's why Maria DiStasio was standing there at 12:30. She was scraping up leaked molasses, from the leak everyone knew about, when the wall behind it let go. An employee named Isaac Gonzalez got so scared of it that he ran to work at night during the quiet hours to check on it. He warned his bosses repeatedly. The response is the micro payoff I promised you. And I'd call it the most honest sentence in this whole story. The company painted the tank brown. Not to protect the steel, to match the leaks. Then January 1919 loaded the trap. Boston had been sitting near 4 degrees, and in 2 days it jumped past 40. 2 days before the flood, a fresh delivery of warm molasses had been pumped in, sitting on top of the cold, dense mass below. Warmth wakes molasses up. It expands and it ferments, and fermentation makes gas, and gas makes pressure. And turns out that pressure was pushing on walls. roughly half as thick as they should have been. When engineers finally ran the numbers decades later, the steel was starved of manganese too, the same brittle when cold weakness that famously plagued the Titanic's plates. A cold, brittle shell, a breathing load, and 4 years of ignored warnings. The machine gun sound was simply the day the math came due, and then the company did something that turns this from a disaster story into a courtroom story. They said it was a bombing. Anarchists, they announced, had climbed the tank and dropped dynamite in. And you have to understand 1919 Boston for why that nearly worked. Italian anarchist bombings were real and in the papers, and the neighborhood buried in molasses happened to be Italian and immigrant and poor. Blaming invisible radicals was cheaper than admitting the tank was a lie, and it very nearly stuck. What stopped it was the lawsuit. Over 100 families and victims joined together. More than 119 claims folded into one of the first great class actions against a corporation in American history. The company put up expert after expert, years of them, all pointing at phantom bombers. The family's lawyers pointed at rivets, steel, and paint. It took 6 years in testimony from thousands of witnesses before the court-appointed auditor, a colonel named Hugh Ogden, delivered the verdict in 1925. No bomb. The tank failed because it was badly built, barely inspected, and knowingly left to leak. United States Industrial Alcohol paid over $600,000, serious millions in today's money, and nobody ever seriously blamed an anarchist. Again. Here's why you're still feeling this flood every day of your life, 100 years later. After Ogden's ruling, Boston stopped taking companies at their word. Major construction now required a licensed engineer's stamped calculations before a permit, and an architect or engineer to sign off on the finished work. The idea spread city by city, state by state, until it became the boring, invisible standard that holds up every bridge, tank, and tower you walked past today. Somebody qualified has to sign. That rule has a birthday, and it's the 15th of January, 1919. One last thing, because every Boston story ends with it. Locals will tell you that on a hot day in the North End, you can still smell molasses rising out of the old pavement. I'd love that to be true. It's a legend. A century of new asphalt says the smell is memory, not chemistry. But I get why the city keeps saying it. 21 people drowned in syrup because paint was cheaper than steel. Some stories? A city decides it isn't allowed to forget. I'm Mello. I dig up the wildest true stories out there. So follow along, and I'll see you in the next one.